Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the 2024 University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar Series, September Seminar. We'll begin our time together with a karakia. Me inoi tātou. Tū tawa mai I runga, tū tawa mai I raro, tū tawa mai I roto, tū tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, ai ki e. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Dr. Kate McAnelly from Te Kuratini Tuwhera, the Open Polytechnic. We're delighted to have Kate with us to share her research and experience exploring how to more expansively understand autistic tamariki and their learning needs in Aotearoa, New Zealand's early childhood education settings. If questions arise for you during the presentation that you would like to ask Kate, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and she'll respond to them at the end of her presentation. You can also use the chat function throughout the presentation to connect with each other and the panelists. After the seminar, a recording will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. I will now pass over to Dr. Jude MacArthur to welcome and introduce Dr. McAnelly. Kia ora, Jude.
Kia ora tēnā tātou katoa, ko te poti te whenua tūpū, kei tamaki me kaurau ahau e noho ana. He kaiako ahau, I waipapa taumatarau. Ko Jude MacArthur taku ingoa. Hello everybody, my name is Jude. You might have heard from my introduction that, like Kate, I am from Ōtepoti, Dunedin, and I'm just really happy to be the person who's been asked to introduce Kate today. She is a very important person in my past life and continues to be with the work that she's doing. So as Justine said, Kate is currently working as a lecturer in early childhood education at Te Kuratini Tuwhera, the Open Polytech in Dunedin. She also has her own business supporting early childhood teachers to strengthen their inclusive practice. I think what makes Kate even more important is that she brings to her work her own lived experience of neurodivergence. And she weaves that beautifully with her knowledge of early childhood education in Aotearoa. And it just makes her work unique. It's always been a pleasure for me to be able to draw on your work, Kate, you know, and the work that we do with students in education. So I just wanted to mention that Kate is also very actively involved in a number of education organisations across Aotearoa and spreading the good word about inclusive practice, you know, very widely. I guess I like to think of her really as a very knowledgeable activist with a sort of a deep interest in early childhood experience and early childhood education and experience in that field. So we look forward to your presentation, Kate. Welcome, and what a beautiful title, Autistic, Flourishing and Inclusive Early Learning Communities. I'll pass over to you.
Okay. Kia ora Jude, kia ora Justine. Nau mai, haere mai I te whānau mātou raka ko huka huka. It's my immense privilege to have you join me for this webinar, Autistic, Flourishing and Inclusive Early Learning Communities today. I'm really excited to take you on this journey of learning and hope that you take lots of food for transformative practice-driven thought away from it. Okay, but before we get underway, I'd like to introduce myself as Tikaka Māori dictates with sharing my mihi. E ka mana, e ka reo, e ka karakataka maha, e ka hau e whā. E mihi ana kia kaitahu te mana whenua o tēnei takiwa. Ko whānau. No kōtirana, ikarahi, airana ki te raki, hui tēnei maka paniora me te whenua moimoia o hoku tūpuna. Ko 3 bells to hoku kaipuki, ko moka atua ka tau moka whakaruru hau. Ko taiari te awa o te takiwa. Ko Lola Mackenzie e mohio tia ana ko mama, rawa ko Beverly Taki e mohio tia ana ko nana. O hoku kuia. Mama kua whetu rakatia, me kua iwa te kaumatahi ka tau o nana inaine. Ko Anne-Marie Brooklyn to hoku hakui, ko Philip Marshall to hoku hakoro. Ko Stephen te haku tatau. Ko David McAnelly te hoku hoa tāne no te iwi o hōrana ia, tōku toru a maua tamariki. Ko Stephen te haku tama, ko Maika rawa ko Bella a haku tamahine. Ko Michael Gaffney te hoku hoa mahia tui me karik oho oho. He pūkeka mātou raka ko hoka hoka ki te kuratini tūwhera aho. He mātanga arahi ki tūranga mono mokopuna aho anō hoki. I whānau mai me akio ki Waihopai, no oti pōti te hoku kaika nai nei. He takata whai taki wātaka whakahia hau, ko Kate McAnelly te hoku e koe nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Okay, so to keep things as brief as possible, my name's Kate McAnelly, and my ancestors came to Aotearoa, New Zealand from Scotland, England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain, a few via Australia, so that I might enjoy the life that I am now privileged to call my own. I was born and raised in Waihopai in Invercargill, but now call Ōtepoti Dunedin home, as Jude has already alluded to, where I live with my husband and our 3 teenage children, and where I work primarily as a regional academic staff member within the Open Polytech's early childhood lecturing team, but also as a lead practitioner for Tūranga Mono Mokopuna, the small independent not-for-profit I established in late 2021, as a means of supporting early childhood kaiako to strengthen their practice through disability, equity and inclusion-oriented lenses. I'm also neurodivergent and am the family member, friend, colleague and counsellor of countless neurodivergent people. It was actually my experience as a mum, walking alongside my now 18-year-old son, who was diagnosed as autistic when he was 3. It feels like just yesterday, but it's been nearly 15 years, which is crazy to contemplate, through his years in early childhood education. Years that were repeatedly punctuated, as has often been the case since, unfortunately, by experiences of marginalisation, disempowerment and exclusion for us all. That led me to go, you know what? I can imagine a space for myself to take my personal experiences as a mum and translate them in professional practice as an early childhood kaiako and become the sort of kaiako that my son and other tamariki like him deserve and don't always get. So that then propelled me, once my undergraduate teaching career was completed, into postgraduate study, where I was, and still am, keen to explore kaupapa of inclusive early childhood curriculum, pedagogies and learning environments, disabled children's childhood studies, children's rights, the sociology of diverse childhoods, and the politics of inclusive education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which, with the current government in place, seems like even more of an important kaupapa to amplify in the public sphere. Kaupapa, specifically speaking to autism and inclusive teaching and learning in early childhood, remain a key priority of mine in my research, and so here we all are. Let's get cracking with Te Kaupapa o Te Rā, autistic flourishing and inclusive early learning communities, and how to support that as a matter of rights. So in order to more affirmatively understand the autistic learner and thus support their flourishing, we need to better understand what autism is and what it isn't. The first whakaaro to really make visible is that autism is rooted primarily in neurological difference. It's only in the last 25 years that this neurological difference has been better understood as being central to autistic experience in a variety of ways. Modern research that explores the neurobiology of autism explains that the neurodevelopmental pathways within the autistic brain can and do look quite different to the non-autistic brain, and that autism has a fundamental impact on how autistic people perceive and experience the world around them. The autistic brain isn't bad, it isn't broken, and it isn't wrong. It's just wired differently. What's required is to work in rights-focused, mana-enhancing ways within the possibilities that difference that autistic tamariki bring with them offers us as early childhood kaiako. Now, autism typically expresses itself, aroha mai, in the lives of autistic people through impairments, though these are judged according to neurotypical views of such, in communication, social interactions and relationships, as well as atypical meaning making of the world. Communication difficulties are a core feature of autism and can often but not exclusively so, present themselves in a couple of ways. The first of these is persistent societal privileging of normative verbal communication, which autistic tamariki typically encounter difficulties in that you may well know their verbal communication capacity. They might be non-speaking all the time, or their verbal communication capacity might fluctuate from moment to moment or day to day, depending on what's going on around them, what's happening for them in their lives. Research in the last 20 years has found that the key cause of communication impairment in autistic tamariki is usually psychological in nature, neurobiology driven, and embedded in difficulties with theory of mind or fully understanding how others think and feel. However, the research also argues that it's unfair to say that this thinking applies to all autistic tamariki, who, as we know, are as diverse as non-autistic tamariki in terms of their abilities, capacities, and development. By and large, unfortunately, the research speaks quite prominently to an othering of autistic social communication capacities as less than. The ways in which verbal communication is so often privileged as the only legitimate gold standard method of communicating is harmful to autistic tamariki, because many of them do not possess verbal communication capacity or cannot rely upon it, as I've already touched on. Expecting autistic tamariki to utilise modes of communication in the same ways non-autistic tamariki do not only violates the autistic tamariki's right to be their unapologetic, authentic selves, but it's also damaging to their autistic meaning making. Inevitably, when the ability to function typically in social relationships and interactions is impaired, the ability of autistic tamariki to form and sustain connections with the people around them is also impacted. This has implications for the practice of early childhood kaiako, whose work with tamariki and whānau is embedded, as we all well know, in a sufficiency of responsive, reciprocal, respectful relationships. We'll get into that more in a wee bit. The literature too identifies that there are two key issues at play in autistic tamariki forming social relationships with others. The first of these is the difficulty engaging in joint attention tasks with others. This difficulty with joint attention often leads to a privileging of verbal communication over non-verbal communication, or however these things come about. This frightens and confuses autistic tamariki who do not always possess verbal communication capacity, but are usually adept at using non-verbal modes of communication, and leads them to either panic at the thought of engaging in a joint attention task or simply avoid the requested task completely. The second key issue is a communication impairment inherent to autistic meaning making. Autistic tamariki are frequently maligned for not being aware of others, and that this lack of awareness is the crux of their difficulties with social relationships. This isn't not only incorrect, but also really unfair, as autistic tamariki are often hyper aware of others and really desire to build relationships with them, but often in line with that, lack the knowledge on how to initiate and sustain those relationships. Further, the social relationships autistic tamariki are able to enjoy are often dependent on the support of the environments that they find themselves in. The provision of that support, or lack thereof, can have a significant impact in either supporting or constraining the ongoing development of the social skills of autistic tamariki. This suggests that the experiences of autistic tamariki in early childhood settings will be better assured by kaiako having more awareness of the atypical means autistic tamariki engage in social relationships with others, rather than expecting autistic tamariki to conform to non-autistic ideals of sociality. But again, we will return to that later in my kōrero. Finally, along with strong preferences for routines and sameness, atypical meaning making of the world around them appears to be par for the course in the research for autistic tamariki. This is like a different, not less, way of experiencing and interpreting the environments autistic tamariki find themselves in. It's now well established in the research that atypical meaning making for autistic tamariki often involves matters of sensory perception, processing, and integration. This research all uniformly demonstrates that sensory perception, processing, and integration are almost always experienced differently by autistic tamariki as opposed to non-autistic tamariki. These atypical modes of sensory perception and processing are related to several areas of participation in everyday living and learning within early learning settings and beyond. As a result, autistic tamariki tend to seek and avoid sensory stimuli in ways that sometimes appear unfamiliar and don't always sit easily with non-autistic tamariki and indeed non-autistic kaiako. A dimension of experience bound up in the atypical autistic meaning making is the presence and mediation of sensory sensitivities. While some autistic tamariki may be hyporeactive or under-responsive to sensory stimuli, the research suggests that it is far more common for them to be hyperreactive or over-responsive to sensory stimuli. This doesn't mean that autistic tamariki will be wholly hypo or hyper-responsive to all sensory stimuli. While this can be the case, it's also quite usual to encounter autistic tamariki who might be a mix of hypo and hyper-responsive to the sensory stimuli that they encounter in their early learning environments. Think, by way of example, of autistic tamariki, though this applies equally as well to non-autistic tamariki too, that you might have come across personally and or professionally who don't seem to notice or be bothered by having mucky hands. So that's being hypo-responsive to that stimuli. Or those who notice such things and must clean their hands up straight away, or simply avoid scenarios in their learning that that they avoid then getting mucky as much as possible. So that's, being hyper-responsive to that stimuli. Sensory sensitivities can present themselves in a variety of ways linked into the autistic tamariki sensory perception, processing, and integration capacities, as well as their dispositional meaning making as learners. Overall, the research maintains, and this is where my PhD research came in as well, I found similar things. The research maintains that where sensory sensitivities are respectfully mediated within the early learning environments that autistic tamariki are a part of, then their experiences of empowerment and inclusion are much better assured. They're also able to regulate and co-regulate their emotions better. Okay, so turning to what's important practice-wise in terms of supporting the flourishing of autistic tamariki in our early learning communities. The attitudes in terms of being ready, willing, and able to teach autistic tamariki well from the beginning. The attitudes that others within early childhood settings hold towards the inclusion of autistic tamariki have been shown in several studies, including my own, as being a prime enabler or conversely constraint in autistic and other disabled tamariki realising an inclusive early childhood education. Of particular focus in the literature is the attitudes that kaiako possess in supporting the inclusion of autistic tamariki. Fundamental to these is expecting, welcoming, and honouring diversity in all its forms, being committed to inclusion as an ethic of care and a professional responsibility, and setting the pace in terms of this is what we do and why we do it here by way of inclusive practice. The findings of many of these studies outline that it's not sufficient for kaiako to have only theoretical knowledge of inclusion. They must also develop or possess a strong disposition towards inclusion in their practice and have the commitment to put their theoretical knowledge into practice to ensure an equitable and inclusive early childhood education for all tamariki right from the start. There is, of course, some tensions inherent in adding new threads to patterns that have already been woven in practice, and that some of these ways of doing things can be troubling and challenging to some kaiako. This then demonstrates a real need to be flexible and open to new ways of being, doing, and knowing as they emerge in your practice. Overall, kaiako taking up a social relational approach to inclusive early childhood education in which barriers to being and doing are recognised and dismantled, and where inclusion for autistic tamariki is viewed as an ordinary element of the program rather than an added strain or an optional extra that you can opt in or out of doing, are fundamental to the experiences of or inclusive early childhood education that autistic tamariki get to have, and I would argue have the right to enjoy. Okay. So now let's get to this kaupapa of autism, accessibility, and the early childhood learning environment. How is this typically understood? So the physical accessibility in a broad sense of the early childhood learning environment in the literature is largely centered on kaupapa of building, of classroom location, the layout of the classroom, and classroom resources, including technologies. Amidst these debates, there's an increasing argument for the physically accessible early learning environment as experienced by autistic tamariki and disabled tamariki more broadly as well, as needing to encompass matters of drawing and learner voice about what's important to them, maintaining a calm and predictable sense of structure and routine to the learning environment and their experiences therein, and flagging any changes to it as soon as is practical. The ways in which attitudes within the early learning environment, beyond those held by kaiako, can support and promote accessibility for autistic tamariki are many and varied within the literature too. These attitudes begin with early childhood settings taking the stance that diversity in all its forms is a strength and an asset, and that there's permeable space within their setting for all sorts of diversity as it presents itself. Dismantling the notion of inclusion as physical presence and being open to the various ways autistic tamariki choose to engage in their learning are crucial inclusive attitudes for everyone involved in early childhood education provision to hold and to practice. The need for kaiako to feel comfortable calling on the knowledge and expertise of whānau to support the inclusive early childhood education of autistic tamariki is also critical. The research appears to be in agreement that the fundamental inclusive attitude members of early learning settings must take is a sense of preparedness and responsibility for the meaningful inclusion of all learners, no matter who they are or what their story is. And this includes autistic learners and the ways in which their autism may express itself. Okay. Turning now to inclusive early childhood curriculum that's permeable to diversity, the sort of approach that Te Whāriki promises all tamariki and their whānau will get to enjoy. Supporting and nurturing this approach to curriculum is founded on recognition of and respect for the individual learning trajectories of autistic tamariki. While the notion of tamariki learning and progressing in their own way and in their own time is well familiar to us all and has been quite prevalent in the field for a while, local curricula and the people who enact them sometimes tend to pigeonhole and homogenize the meaning making of tamariki as needing to fit neatly into a particular box, and thus construe that only some kinds of diversity are desirable and or valuable, which is hard to understand given the expansive conceptions and expectations of inclusion embedded throughout Te Whāriki, but nonetheless kaiako sometimes do struggle to translate inclusive theory into inclusive practice. Consequently, autistic tamariki can tend to be measured against normative standards of learning and of progress, which are usually inappropriate and unfair. Autistic tamariki are often subject to having their learning trajectories rendered silent and or invisible through practices that seek to normalize dispositional learning and modes of meaning making, and suggests that any interventions or changes to the way things are done need to be well evidenced in the research, the current contemporary modern research. Alongside that, in the last 10 years, emerging scholarship has spoken to the flourishing of individual learning trajectories of autistic tamariki when the diversity is construed as a strength and an asset, and differentiated conceptualizations of and approaches to the active participation in learning being employed in practice. The key approach the literature describes and has underpinned my mahi as well, in terms of how the early childhood curriculum might be permeable to and responsive to the diverse modes of communication and meaning making of tamariki, is the Reggio Emilia notion of the 100 languages of children. The 100 languages point to the many different ways tamariki make sense of the world, represent their knowledge, express their creativity and thoughts, and wonder and inquire about the world around them. This is particularly so regarding how the 100 languages set out that there are many different ways of being, doing, and knowing, and all of them are just as legitimate as the others. The notion of children's 100 languages is especially applicable to the communication and meaning making of autistic tamariki, as it seeks to draw on the many different ways autistic tamariki might choose to use in communicating and engaging with the world around them, that there's many different ways to deliver a message, for them to tell you what they want or need you to know. A curriculum that's permeable to diversity in this way, a kindergarten kaiako shared with me in my master's dissertation research, values those 100 languages, nurtures those 100 languages, engages with and interprets those 100 languages, and supports tamariki to make them visible and meaningful so that the tamariki feels strong, powerful, and is equal to the task of learning as for all non-disabled tamariki. This also, to my mind's eye, reflects the inclusive intent of Te Whāriki as a rights-focused, mana-enhancing curriculum for all tamariki. Central to the ways in which the education literature suggests inclusive early childhood curriculum might foster positive, powerful learning identities in tamariki is a strong and powerful image of all tamariki. Such standpoints breed discourses of rights, equity, and inclusion for all. These then enable tamariki to take up a variety of opportunities within the curriculum that empower them and affirm their diverse viewpoints and modes of meaning making. Unfortunately, the literature appears to suggest that the learning identities of autistic tamariki are not so readily seen and worked with in early childhood settings. They don't always benefit from conceptions of them as capable and competent learners. Instead, they tend to become the missing in the supposedly inclusive early learning environment, with a tenuous hold at best on participation and learning. But a transformative shift can take place if kaiako expand and differentiate pedagogy and practice to sensitively encompass the learning needs of autistic tamariki, however these present themselves. Excuse me. So there are a number of things that early childhood kaiako out there report in terms of feeling like they haven't had sufficient experience of working with diverse learners before in order to say or feel that they can do a good job of doing inclusive education. And one barrier that's come up is the ways in which initial teacher education programs they feel don't necessarily equip them with, they do equip initial teacher education programs, and the research has reflected that they might equip, some research participants have spoken to, are equipped with some of the knowledge of inclusive theory, but not the skill set that they felt they needed to be inclusive educators. Thus, they didn't feel well prepared for teaching autistic tamariki. This then has a flow-on effect of effectively playing catch-up while in the field once their undergraduate degree's finished teaching, and trying to integrate knowledge and experience of autism and autistic meaning making alongside everyday teaching responsibilities. This sense of overwhelm is in turn compounded by a lack of meaningful, ongoing, funded professional learning and development opportunities. Overall, the literature again suggests that early childhood kaiako don't always feel prepared to do their best by autistic tamariki in practice, and that yes, by and large, the kaiako that I've come across are almost without fail very disposed towards inclusion, but they lack the knowledge or the confidence to take that further and really embed inclusive values in practice. A flexible approach to practice that draws on differentiating approaches with and for autistic tamariki is a critical component of inclusive early childhood teaching and learning. The most compelling argument that the literature presents is kaiako figuring out where the learning needs of autistic tamariki lay and how those needs will be met within their environment as a matter of rights. I think for autistic tamariki in particular, when discussing their learning needs and rights, they also have the right to have their diverse modes of sensory meaning making expected, welcomed, and honoured. Sometimes hard questions might need to be asked of the early childhood learning environment and the people, places, and things they're in. And the environment, as well as the practices that sustain it, might have to be rethought as a result if they're found to be not meeting the learning needs of autistic tamariki in a responsive and respectful way. Changing approaches as the learning needs of autistic tamariki themselves shift and change, rather than assuming what worked once will always work in the same way, are essential to inclusive practice that affirms the learning potentials, dignity, rights, and mana of autistic tamariki. These sorts of approaches lead to autistic tamariki feeling like they belong and have a place in our early learning communities, as is their right. Now, we as kaiako also need to rethink how we understand and enact participation with, by, and for autistic tamariki in our early learning communities. The sort of participation that leads to autistic tamariki learning, thriving, realising and practising citizenship, and as I've alluded to in the title of the webinar, flourishing, is not about their being physically present in a centre building. It's also completely out of whack with Te Whāriki's expectations of the participation all tamariki could and should be able to enjoy. However, that's how the participation of all tamariki has long been constituted in the literature, with various conditions attached and assumptions and misunderstandings of mana and affirming and enhancing practice at play. Disabled tamariki have been particularly vulnerable to these discourses of inclusion as physical presence. Autistic tamariki, in truth, often have difficulty even accessing the opportunity to participate in early childhood settings, and when they do, they're sometimes faced with charity and pity-laden theorising that illustrates the autistic tamaiti as fundamentally defective and the kaiako as a do-gooder. The research holds firm in its conception that these notions do not constitute legitimate participation. That is, where autistic tamariki learn according to their preferences and dispositions, just as we view non-autistic tamariki doing. That autistic tamariki get to actively participate in decision-making that informs the local curriculum, and that they have the opportunity to realise and practice citizenship underpinned by respect for who they are, rather than trying to make them into something or someone that they're not. What we as kaiako are looking for instead is to support the realisation of active participation for autistic tamariki. And that's where participation takes 4 dimensions, and those being ecological, pedagogic, equitable, and inclusive. This is some mahi that I've helped advance in my own research. Responsive and reciprocal relationships with people, places, and things that value the richness of diversity, difference, and the various ways of interpreting the world that autistic tamariki bring with them are a core theme of pedagogic participation, as is realising a common image of all early learning community members as capable, competent, and agentic citizens, rich in learning potentials, abundant in multiple intelligences for ecological participation. Equitable and inclusive participation highlighted the importance of the voices of tamariki and their whānau, and the right to engage in democratic decision-making processes within their early learning communities. All of this, in turn, is underpinned by the notion that inclusive education for all is framed as a fundamental, inalienable human right in early learning communities. These are all things that autistic tamariki can and should be right amongst. So, now if we pivot to think about autistic tamariki and their learning more specifically, the research reflects that they often sit outside conceptions of being honoured for knowing what learning is important to them, as well as how to go about it, as non-autistic tamariki are often portrayed. Instead, they are frequently othered as incapable and rendered as ineffectual learners according to normative definitions of achievement. There is an abundance of evidence in the early childhood research that speaks to learning being something that all tamariki can do in their own way and in their own time, given the space and the trust from people around tamariki to do so. Foundational to this understanding is an image of education as building a safety net to support our tamariki, as well as a belief where opportunities for learning are afforded to all autistic tamariki or all tamariki, not just those who are perhaps easier to understand, support, and get along with. This sort of approach addresses tensions of normativity and low expectations that have historically been woven through much of early childhood education discourse, where inclusion, autism, and disability more broadly have butted into one another. These inclusive aspirations for the learning of autistic tamariki are underpinned by an enduring respect for diverse meaning making, however it comes, determination not to pigeonhole or homogenize their achievements, and presumption of competence in both their learning and their humanity. Further, as a revisit to a whakaaro touched on throughout so far, how we inclusively understand autistic tamariki as learners must include sensitive understanding of and respect for the diverse modes of sensory meaning making. Inclusion of autistic tamariki, I argue, in fact, cannot be understood without this whakaaro being part of the kōrero. Finally, we need to take up an explicit rights orientation to our practice if we are to better support the flourishing of autistic tamariki in our early learning communities. The right to an equitable, inclusive early childhood education is something that autistic and non-autistic tamariki alike possess. It's an inalienable right, and I've touched on that just before. But what that means is that there's nothing autistic tamariki can be or do that takes that right away from them. Let's wrap up our substantive kōrero here with reflecting on how and where autistic tamariki fit into the following in light of what I've covered off today, as per the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Autistic tamariki have the right to be viewed as capable, competent learners and have right of access to all learning experiences on offer in the early learning community. The rights of autistic tamariki to agency and citizenship, to have a voice and make a difference to what's on offer in their early learning community. And thinking too of this statement that can be found in the underpinning theories and approaches section on page 61 of Te Whāriki, which says that kaiako will work to uphold and protect children's rights, interests, and points of view from the earliest ages. They recognise children as citizens and preserve their dignity while building their mana and supporting them to build the mana of others. So, e te whānau, let's go forth as we recognise autistic tamariki as citizens, preserve their dignity, and affirm and enhance their rights and their mana within early learning communities that actively support their active participation, learning, and flourishing. Kia ora. So I'll just quickly go through these before we get to ka pātai. So hopefully if you're watching this recording, that some of the mahi that I've done with my colleague, Dr. Michael Gaffney, in and around disability, equity and inclusion in early childhood education, that a lot of it is available on Google Scholar if you care to look it up, if you haven't come into contact with it already. And here is a list of some other amazing research by other folk in New Zealand and around the world that I really recommend if you want to expand your conceptions of autism and inclusion in education. Okay, so ka pātai. Questions, I guess it's over to you again, Jude, I think, to feedback.
Ngā mihi. Ngā mihi, Kate. Thank you very much for your presentation. It has got a few people thinking. I can see there's a couple of questions on the Q&A. So I can just encourage other people to pop your questions onto Q&A if you have them, and we'll work through those. I hope you don't mind, but I would like to start with a question from myself first, and then I'm going to go to the question that's on the Q&A. So I've just been listening to you talking about, you know, honouring autistic children for knowing what will work for them, like the children themselves. Tell us a lot about what their experience is and what's going to work best for them in terms of supporting their learning and their flourishing and their belonging in a centre. And you've talked about, you know, we need to ensure that autistic children have a voice and so on. You've talked about how we need to ensure that we connect with whānau in particular to learn more about the child and to know the child really well.
Mm.
So none of those things strike me as being particularly unusual, and they seem to me to be all things that we would want good early childhood teachers to be doing anyway for any child. And so my question really is, what do you say to early childhood teachers who genuinely feel that they don't know enough? You know, they might say, for example, well, I just don't have the specialist knowledge of autism. You know, I'm not prepared to teach those kids. I didn't get this in my training and so on. What would you say to those teachers?
Well, a lot of the mahi that I've been doing in and around the place has been focused on disabled children's rights. And so I would encourage kaiako who are not confident or are potentially within that a wee bit resistant to creating and sustaining practice that's inclusive of autistic learners to reframe how they conceive of inclusive practice through a lens of rights. And I've found that so far with the kaiako I've spoken to around the motu, I've had the privilege of speaking to that introduction of rights versus needs as a framing for practice can fundamentally reframe how they conceive of their responsibility to teach all learners well from the start. I'd also encourage as well for kaiako who might be not sure or not confident to tap into the funds of knowledge and expertise that others around them have. Look out for professional learning and development opportunities that strengthen your inclusive practices, because they are out there. And I think more than anything, if you're wanting to, yes, develop how would I frame this? Inclusive practices, and you're wanting to get to know more about particular tamariki, you must always acknowledge and respects the power and the funds of knowledge and expertise that whānau bring with them, because more than anything, whānau know far more than we do about their tamariki, and whānau are a rich fount of knowledge for kaiako to tap into, so it's contingent on us to recognise and respect that power that they bring with them.
So one of the questions on the Q&A is why don't we get this material about neurodivergence amongst children and in our own early childhood education training? And just to follow on from that, you know, this person said they did actually get a bit of special training. It's framed as special education. So you might want to comment on that. But that for some teachers, there's a sort of a sense that it's not my job to do this stuff with the autistic kids. It's the job of the speech language therapist or maybe the early intervention teacher or whatever. So maybe, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, and as much as I can. I'd first, going back to the whakaaro that you were just speaking to, when you, that some kaiako might say, it's not my responsibility, it is your responsibility. You are bound by at CODA standards to teach in equitable and inclusive ways. That doesn't mean just for some tamariki to the exclusion of others. You are professionally bound to teach equitably and inclusively, and to affirm the mana of all tamariki, not just some. So I'm not quite sure what else I can say to that. That's a fundamental shift, I think, from what kaiako are potentially used to hearing, but that's my thinking anyway. As to the inclusion of neurodivergence oriented material and inclusive teacher education programs, that's a good question, and I feel like there should definitely be definitely be more of a focus on, it's not just necessarily, I think, neurodivergence, but in particular a greater focus on diverse learning needs and inclusive practices within the content of undergraduate and postgraduate teaching qualifications. But I think that course content varies, as I understand it, from institution to institution. It can also vary on the staff within particular programs, and some institutions may have a stronger focus and a stronger inclusive education curriculum within their programs accordingly. But yes, certainly I think I would like to see a greater emphasis placed on supporting inclusive teaching dispositions within programs, but I'm not quite sure where that's at. I don't think, as I understand it, that there's a universal framework for such things within Aotearoa New Zealand. Jude, you might be better placed to, in terms of your experience in the field, as to
Yeah, I mean, I know there
it
are.
does or doesn't look like.
Yeah. I could do a little bit of a plug for some of the courses we offer ourselves, but I mean, we do offer a postgraduate course on neurodiversity and inclusive practice at Auckland University, and that's for students at any level, early childhood, primary and secondary. So if any people want to know about that, I'm happy to say a little bit more. I've just found a couple more questions in the chat. So do you mind if I just pass those on to you?
No worries.
So this is from one person who said they worked in a centre that had quite a significant number, 10 to 15 neurodivergent learners in their centre, but not surprisingly, not much in the way of additional professional support around. And this person said, in reality, some of those children needed one-to-one on a consistent basis for many hours. So maybe you might want to just comment on that. They also said that in their case, an unqualified teacher spent a couple of hours with one autistic child. What would be the model of practice that you would recommend in a centre? You might have an ESW, for example, you might not have anything else. But in terms of the way teachers practice inclusively, what would you be?
Right, yeah. So if there is an ESW or a similar sort of staff member involved in a centre, I would encourage kaiako to deploy or support the ESW to work in ways that don't draw disabled or autistic tamariki away from opportunities to engage alongside peers in the everyday curriculum and the everyday program. So one of the centres that I spent time in for my PhD data collection, one of the ESWs that was there really struggled to work in ways that I was just alluding to, and had come from quite an old school model of ESW practice where she essentially said, well, if I'm not Velcroing myself to the child and working intensively on a one-on-one scenario with them, then I'm not doing my job properly. And so the kaiako at the centre had worked with the ESW in ways that she would still be working with my focus tamariki that supported me to co-produce the research in ways that didn't remove him from participation alongside his peers in opportunities within the everyday curriculum and the everyday programs. That meant working alongside him essentially in groups of different sizes, often in smaller groups, but nonetheless it was never in a one-on-one type scenario, which the research speaks to as being counter to the inclusive intent of or the responsibilities of inclusive teaching. And another thing to just point out as well is that it still remains, even if an ESW is part of the picture, it still remains a responsibility of the kaiako for teaching, rather than leaving responsibility for monitoring or sort of herding disabled tamariki sometimes, as I've seen, to ESWs.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I agree with you. I just have to say the same applies in the school setting. Here's there is a comment and then leading into someone else's question, because I think they're connected. So one person in the chat has said, thank you for talking about the connections with whānau and how important that is, that whānau are the experts. The child is an expert and whānau are experts, and together you've got an enormous wealth of knowledge there that teachers can use and work from. And then related to that is a question, I think it's related anyway. I struggle to understand tamariki who are nonverbal and what they want in the moment. And I can see them getting frustrated. How can I know what they want or are trying to tell me? It's a good question.
It is. And I guess the advice that I could give to that respondent is, just for example, when I have gone in doing my data collection for my PhD, for example, and in my teaching more generally, when you come to know a tamaiti well, in this case, we might be talking about a non-speaking autistic tamariki. When you come to know them well, then you also come to know their non-verbal modes of communication. And the ways in which they might be trying to tell you what they want or they need you to know. And I do acknowledge as well that amidst the noise and the haste and the busyness of everyday practice in an early learning setting, it's sometimes easy to miss cues that tamariki might provide for us, or to potentially misinterpret them, or to not necessarily have the time to actively listen and kind. But I think in terms of just a broad response to that question is that if you're not, I think you probably know a lot more than you think, if you have the sufficiency of responsive, respectful, reciprocal relationships with that tamaiti and with that whānau.
Thanks, Kate. And there are some good visual systems out there available too that children can use to communicate readily, but often the family are whānau are very aware of what those are as well. So again, it's that communication that you're talking about there. Here's a good question, is about the language. So no doubt people have picked up on yours and my use of the term autistic child. So the question is there a difference between the way we refer to tamariki? So what is the difference between autistic tamariki and tamariki with autism? When we call it
yes, that's actually a good point that I probably should have touched on. So kia ora, respondent. So the difference between those two sets of terminologies is the use of identity first versus person first language. And so in my experience as a researcher and as a PLD facilitator, person first language, which is, a child with autism, is what's been embedded in most initial teacher education programs, and is what most kaiako are familiar and comfortable with, and they feel quite challenged by the use of autistic child. Person first language seeks to acknowledge that there is a person in ahead of a disability, that disability isn't a defining feature of someone's life. Whereas opposed to that, we have identity first language, that would be saying autistic child, and that is my preference as a neurodivergent person, and that's what I embed in my research, and is indeed the preference of increasing amounts, although not all, of the disability community. And that basically acknowledges the barriers that disabled tamariki, disabled people encounter in society, and it is that disability is inherent to their humanity, and indeed that they are disabled by the barriers that society puts in their way in their lives. So probably the key recommendation in and around the use of identity first versus person first language is that it is not for us as kaiako to decide how disabled tamariki and their whānau are allowed to identify. That is up to the disabled tamaiti themselves and or their whānau to choose how they wish to identify, and our job as kaiako is to run with what the tamaiti and their whānau choose.
Here's one about teachers. Why is it still normal practice for some teachers to mask their own neurodiversity?
That's a really good question, and indeed I myself did for a really long time. And I mean, I guess I can only speak to my own experience, is that sometimes unmasking can be really scary in terms of people will think differently or less of you. That was always a big concern of my own. Not just your colleagues, but the whānau of the tamariki that you teach. I would like to see a model of working in not only in ECE but in education more broadly, where the rich potentials of neurodivergence that kaiako bring with them. And actually, indeed, some of my colleagues at the Open Polytech have been doing some really amazing work around the perspectives of disabled kaiako and ECE. That's worth looking up. Where the rich potentials of disability and neurodivergence and diversity more broadly are recognised for the potentials they bring to broaden and support the reconception of what inclusive teaching and learning looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Somebody here has asked whether you've come across any information about what appears to be an increased correlation between autism and ADHD, and maybe comment on that, and is that something that teachers would need to know about?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure. There's been a shift in terminology, so and I can't quite recall what the new terminology is, but it is acknowledged in the research that there is like a quite significant correlation between autism and ADHD. So that means that and it used to be called comorbidities, but I am aware that that is not the terminology anymore, but I don't know what the new terminology is, and that it is not uncommon for a tamaiti or a person to experience both autism and ADHD as a mix within their neurodivergence. They're both expressions of neurodivergence. Autism is, but one expression. ADHD is another. But no, it is definitely not uncommon for tamariki to, it's not exclusively so, but it is not uncommon for tamariki to be both autistic and have ADHD. But so I guess that knowledge in and of itself is something to be cognizant of in terms of equitably and inclusively meeting the needs of those tamariki.
Thank you. I think we've gone through all of the questions. Can I squeeze in one that you could try and answer in like 1 minute, looking at 5:28?
Sure.
Because this is a burning question in my mind. I'm interested in how early childhood teachers, once they've got a centre where they really do promote autistic flourishing, how can they convey that mindset to the school setting when the child transitions to school?
Oh, wow. That's a very good question. And one can only hope in the transition process that, yes, the school is open to hearing and embedding the early childhood perspectives in terms of funds of knowledge, of expertise around inclusion and what's worked for the tamaiti coming into the process. That they're willing to take those funds of knowledge and their expertise in terms of, creating and sustaining a transition process that's affirms and enhances the mana, and indeed the safety and security and the sense of belonging that disabled tamariki will get to experience coming out of that process and transitioning into the school setting. But I certainly think that, primary school settings, have a lot to learn. I know that I am fully biased and I fully own that, but I do think that primary school settings could learn a great deal from early childhood in terms of how we perceive and practice inclusion.
And I see, Justine, thank you very much. That was a great answer and very quick. So somebody has said in the chat, ka pai tō kōrero, Kate. Thank you very much. There's lots of positive comments coming up.
Right.
And so on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. Really informative and interesting session. Justine, I'll hand it over to you.
Kia ora, Jude. And ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Kate, for your presentation. You have given us all a great deal to think about in regard to reorienting our image of neurodivergent Māori and considering how we can sustain an explicit rights and mana-oriented approach to inclusive and responsive practice in early childhood settings. So anō ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Kate. We really appreciate your sharing of your expertise and your insights, and I will make sure that you get a copy of all of the fantastic feedback that you are getting down in the chat.
Kia ora, Justine.
So ngā mihi nui ki a koutou for joining us for this seminar. If you want to share or revisit this presentation, which I'm sure many of you will want to do, please check out our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. The recording of this seminar will be available in a few days. And we look forward to seeing you again in November for our next online seminar with Associate Professor Sue Cherrington from Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information for that. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today, and we'll close with karakia. Me noa tātou. Kia tau te rangi Māori e, o te rangi i te iho nei, o papatuanuku i tākoto nei, o te tai au i awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou, tihei mauri ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. Take good care, everyone. Ka kite anō.